Hello, my name is Tyler Stenger. This is my final project for FES 3822, Disaster Policy and Emergency Management. Today we're going to be talking a little bit about the policies that came into effect after 9/11. So pretty much we're going to be identifying and exploring the various policies that were enacted after the terrorist attacks. We're going to identify how these policies affected people here in the United States, as well as see how and if these policies even still continue to affect us here. So first we'll do a quick little overview. So obviously we know we have 4 phases of emergency management. We have mitigation, preparedness, response, and also a recovery phase. Our mitigation pretty much can be defined as a sustained action to reduce or eliminate the risk to people and property from hazards and their effects. So this is really more of a long-term solution to reducing risk. Some examples of this would be establishing and enforcing updated building codes. For example, after Hurricane Andrew and all the damage that caused, we saw a huge change in the building codes so that all the new buildings should be able to stand at least, I believe it was Category 3 hurricanes. We also installing warning systems to alert the public, building key infrastructure away from hazard zones, establishing evacuation plans prior to disasters. All good examples of mitigation factors prior to even the threat of a disaster occurring. So next we have preparedness, which is a state of readiness to respond to any disaster, crisis, or other type of emergency we might find. So good examples of this here could be just general public education, and then also training for first responders. So any good examples such as some of the large MCI scenarios that you see fire departments do, or hazmat situations, stuff to where get training on some of these potential disasters we could face, just so that once they actually happen, they're much easier to deal with. Dealing with going on to the response, this one's pretty self-explanatory. This is just going to be the immediate response after the disaster occurs. So pretty much it's going to be involved with most of your first responders. They're going to be your frontline guys, your fire departments, your EMS, your law enforcement, and pretty much that's going to start out with your local resources. It can expand to the state and federal level as needed. So during this time, we're pretty much focusing on saving lives, protecting property, and providing any basic human needs such as food, water, shelter. And then once all that's taken care of, we can move on to the recovery phase. Here we're pretty much trying to aim to return the community, the affected community, back to its state pre-disaster. This can take anywhere from days to months and even years. You saw Hurricane Katrina and how long it took them years to fully recover, if they even have still fully recovered from it. So this is a very expensive step. This is where you end up having to restore utilities. Obviously, that's going to be one of the first things you do, repairing any roads and other infrastructure, and then rebuilding all the homes and businesses and any other buildings that come into play. This step can be helped out a lot when the president declares an emergency. So that brings in all the federal help. So you'll be getting help from FEMA and other non-government organizations such as the Red Cross and others. They'll all come in and help out a lot. So also a brief history here for emergency management. And there's a common theme through a lot of this that I want to kind of point out. So obviously we have our first example all the way back in 1803 when a town in New Hampshire was devastated by fires. That's the first time the federal government really stepped in to help out. But it wasn't until into the 1950s that we really saw one of our first significant federal policies, and that was the Disaster Relief Act of 1950. And at the time, it was only federal aid during the actual response, not anything really afterwards. And during this time period, there was a strong focus on civil defense, just because we had the Cold War at the time, and the threat of nuclear attacks was considered the biggest threat. So all the emergency management at the time was more geared towards civil defense Once we got into the 60s, we saw the entire decade that was marked heavily with natural disasters. There were multiple hurricanes, there was earthquakes, flooding, there was even a tsunami. So we saw a big shift in the focus from civil defense from the 50s to now that we had all this going on, more of a focus on responding to natural disasters. We even later in the decade had the National Flood Insurance Program pop up in 1968. After a bunch of hurricanes where there was immense flooding, the flooding insurance became way too expensive for most average folks, so the government stepped in to make sure they could all afford some type of flooding insurance. Into the 70s, continued expansion of emergency management into programs and across multiple agencies kind of made it kind of chaotic. So we saw President Carter at the time pretty much consolidate all these different programs into a single one, which is when FEMA came about in 1978, and this was during the reorganization plan number 3. Into the 80s, some of the threat from the Soviet Union, I guess, started to return, so we saw more of a focus come back to civil defense again, at least up until the Cold War ended in the late 80s. And once again here into it's really starting in 1989 and into the 90s, we saw another huge overhaul of emergency management. There were multiple between Hurricane Andrew and a couple others. There were a few failed responses by FEMA. And so we saw an overhaul where it was, we had a new director come in, James Leawitt, and he was the first FEMA director that actually came in with experience in actual emergency management. So he overhauled most of the system, and we saw a new approach, more of an all hazards type of approach, to where we were really going to try to be ready for everything instead of just kind of being, whether it was civil defense or natural disasters, we really needed an all-encompassing type thing. And it was pretty successful. We had several successful responses in the mid and late decade in the 90s to multiple different types of natural disasters. In the 90s, this is also when we saw our first couple occurrences of terrorism here in the United States. We had the first attacks on the World Trade Center with an attempted car bomb in 1992. That luckily didn't go as planned. And then we also had in 1995, we had the Oklahoma City bombing, which was quite devastating. And then moving into the 2000s, the main thing, first thing off the bat, we had obviously the 9/11 attacks, which created a major shift in the focus of emergency management towards terrorism. And then we also, right afterwards, had a lot of major reform to the federal emergency management system. And that's mostly what we're going to be talking about here today a little bit. But the main point I wanted to make with all that is every step along the way, even though we try to be preemptive about stuff, the biggest changes along the way, the biggest changes in policies always seem to be very reactive in nature. And I think one of the best examples of that is obviously the policies that came into effect after 9/11. And it's something that nobody was really expecting. It was hard to predict for. And so all these policies that came into effect were very reactive, and you're going to see a little bit of that in some here that we talk about. So just real quickly, explanation on 9/11. It was basically a well-orchestrated attack by Al-Qaeda members, which ended up leading to the largest disaster in U.S. history. The attacks were believed to be in response to the United States' support of Israel, also some involvement in the Persian Gulf War, and the continued military presence throughout the Middle East at the time. So obviously we had 4 airplanes that were hijacked. They were destined for cross-country, so they were full of fuel. 2 of them went and collided with World Trade Centers, with another one crashing into the Pentagon, and one last one, which happened to be Flight 93, luckily delayed on the ground a little bit, and it seems like maybe some of the passengers had caught wind of the other hijackings. Mid-air, they realized that theirs had also been hijacked, and they were able to do something about it, tried to take the plane over, and ended up crashing into luckily nowhere. So no extra casualties, only those on the plane. But still, even with all the rest of the destruction, as you can see, we had nearly 3,000 people total killed, with 343 firefighters, as we all know, and even 60 law enforcement. On top of that, in general, we had over 6,000 people injured. All right, some of the policies that came around after 9/11. Some of them we all know about, some are a little less obvious. Most of us know about the first couple here: the Homeland Security Act, the Patriot Act, the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, which brought about TSA. And then we also have a couple other ones here: the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act, National Security Entry-Exit Registration System, and then we also have just some random ones there I kind of wrote in here in a little bit. So, Homeland Security Act here. So this was signed into law a little bit after 9/11 by President Bush there in 2002. The biggest thing here, it established a new Department of Homeland Security. We had a huge reorganization of government here. It was actually the largest reorganization since President Truman reorganized the branches of the armed forces into the Department of Defense. So we had three main objectives here with the Homeland Security Act. Obviously, the biggest one is to protect the United States from future terrorist attacks, but they also wanted to reduce the nation's vulnerability to terrorism in general, as well as minimize the damage from potential terrorist attacks and natural disasters. So a lot of mitigation wanted to go on there. One other major thing, FEMA was also moved into the Department of Homeland Security instead of being its own self-standing department. Move on to the Patriot Act. This has been a controversial piece of legislation. We have, let's see. So it ended up being something that was quickly passed right after 9/11. Kind of like I was saying, very reactionary. Quickly enough that Senator Ron Wyden actually realized that there were several sketchy kind of provisions in the act, and in order to deal with those, he actually added a 5-year countdown clock for 3 of the most questionable provisions. Basically, what that countdown clock did was it made it so that those 3 had to be reevaluated within those 5 years. If those 5 years passed and they weren't reevaluated, they would basically just expire and cease to exist. But those provisions were revised a few times, or reevaluated anyways, and were extended. And actually, in 2015, they were modified and were actually recreated into the USA Freedom Act, with one major change being that instead of being able to just collect broad, large quantities of data, that it's more specialized, very specific in what they're allowed to try and acquire. In 2013, there was that was when Edward Snowden was working for the NSA and realized exactly how much information they were actually getting from the average person, and he ended up leaking a whole bunch of information and documents that really brought the Patriot Act back to light, and just how controversial it really was. Let's see. So there's a couple other main things other than just the surveillance that the Patriot Act did. So not only did it increase the government's ability to survey, investigate, and detail suspected terrorists, but it also created new crimes, terrorist-related crimes that people could be charged with. Also, a good thing it did was it created federal funding to assist the victims of terrorism, and it gave them a new power to be able to track and seize money that they believe is connected to terrorism. So a little bit more here. There were some major changes along the way. Obviously, as I said, it was very reactionary, and it was designed to be reevaluated and changed. So for example, one major thing, the Supreme Court decided to rule that it was illegal to detain the illegal immigrants who were not charged with a crime indefinitely, as they had been, like we mentioned Ron Wyden earlier. So the three provisions that were in that countdown clock. The most prominent one that most people would know about is probably Section 215. That's the one that where it allowed the government broad power to ask businesses for records relating to someone who may be involved in terrorism. And this is the one that was affected by Edward Snowden's leak. There's a couple other ones, sections 206 and 207. 206 allowed the government to tap every device the person uses, and all they needed was a very simple to obtain approval from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. 207 was actually known as the Lone Wolf provision, and allowed the government to survey anyone who they suspect might be involved in international terrorism, even if they had no current connection to a terrorism group. One last thing, so those other ones there were ones that were modified and designed to potentially expire. There was one very controversial piece of legislation in there that was permanent, and that was the National Security Letters Program. And this was one that it pretty much gave the government the ability to not even need to get approval to demand communication records from telecom companies. So, like we said earlier, they needed the approval from the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. Well, this National Security Letter Program pretty much made it so they didn't even have to ask for permission. They could just go and request it. Moving on to the Aviation and Transport Security Act. This is the one that affected pretty much the way that we get ready to board an airplane, or even technically any other type of transportation. So prior to 9/11, security measures in the United States airports was much more lax than what you see today for anybody that hasn't flown pre-9/11. And the actual events of 9/11 were a pretty eye-opening experience that showed just how vulnerable our airline security really was. Just for example, prior to 9/11, it was even possible to bring things such as baseball bats, knitting needles, scissors, darts, box cutters, like the terrorists ended up doing, and even knives with blades of up to 4 inches long. All that was able to be brought on board on your carry-on. Much of this has changed now, obviously. One of the other big things that the Aviation and Transportation Security Act brought in, it created the Transportation Security Administration, which we all know as TSA. So pretty much prior to 9/11, all security was pretty much hired third party by the airlines. Implementing this act put all of the responsibility of the security back on or to the federal government instead, and that's what TSA is involved in. Some of the big changes with that, new employees had a much stricter hiring process and vetting process, and once hired, they also had much more in-depth training on being able to recognize potential threats. A few other security measures that changed. We now have more reinforced cockpit doors, which are required to stay closed at all times. The pilots actually have cameras also up there so they can see what's going on in the cabin. We had a significant increase in the number of air marshals. I saw somewhere it said they went from having 35 to over 1,000. And we also had the creation of the no-fly list. So here's a couple of the lesser known acts that came along. So we have the Enhanced Border Security and Visa Entry Reform Act. So this was basically signed into law about 8 months or so after the terrorist attacks by President Bush. A couple things that this did: it required the Immigration and Naturalization Service to make all of its internal databases interoperable, so that information about any alien could be accessed easily, all in one shot. It also required that all travel documents, including visas, that are issued to aliens be not only machine readable but also tamper resistant, and have to include a standard biometric identifier. Lastly, it required that federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies have to be able to share data on aliens with the INS and the State Department. And one more here, the National Security Entry-Exit Registration System. So this was originally signed in by President Bush about a year after 9/11, and it was a system for registering certain non-citizens. Pretty much the goal was to increase the screening of travelers from specific countries, coming pretty much Muslim cultures in Middle East area. All these people were required to register and be fingerprinted, photographed, and interviewed about their plans during their travel. Later on in 2011, a lot of the aspects of this were suspended, and eventually the entire thing was removed in 2016 by President Barack Obama. Just a few more here, just random things that ended up changing. We had some massive changes in the building codes suggested by the International Code Council. Some of these included that additional stairwells for buildings greater than 24 foot, the need for elevators that are still usable during emergencies, and some higher fire resistant and impact resistant walls that surround both the elevators and the stairwells. A big thing that came a few years later, the James Zadroga 9/11 Health Compensation Act. This was to give health care to all the people that were suffering as a result of responding to 9/11 that day. It's something that continues now and hopefully continues for much longer. Those guys are really in need of some help there. In 2003, we had the National Incident Management System, NIMS, that we all use now for incident management. That came along shortly after 9/11, and then we also, one other huge benefit is the increased first responder preparedness, just in general, for various hazards. Previously, fire departments, they ran fires, medical calls, that kind of thing, and you've seen as we progress through the years that they're capable of responding to almost any type of disaster now, whether it be hazmat related, terrorism related, natural disasters, any kind of thing. So we've seen the first responders take on that increased preparedness so that they can respond to pretty much any type of hazard. I think that pretty much wraps us up here. Just list all the sources I used today. I did learn a little bit. I actually learned a lot, and I hope you enjoyed.